he just, so we waited and waited and waited, and finally the same doctor came back, and he says, well, he says, according to the scans, he says, we can't get the top half of him in. He says, as far as we can tell, his upper arm is broken. It seems like a clean break, but it's so swollen, it's hard to really get a good clean shot of it. He says his lower right arm is in like probably 20 pieces. He says it's hard to tell. He says it doesn't appear that there's other broken bones. He says, but we're going to treat him as if, everything is broken. He says the gash on his leg, we need to sew up. He says it just barely missed the artery. He says if anything, it looks like, a big chunk of fat pushed, the artery kind of out of the way on impact when it tore. It just filleted open. But it was very large, and there was still an awful lot of blood coming from it. The one in his stomach did not break this barrier that basically holds all your organs in. He says he got lucky. He says, but he says again, until we get in there, we can clean it up. It's too hard to tell the extent of the actual damage. He says, but we're gonna assume, he's got more wrong than what we're seeing. He says, until some of the swelling goes down, we can't tell. So, he says they're wheeling him up to surgery now. They're gonna have a nurse come get you, and they'll show you how to get up to the surgery waiting. He says they're gonna take you to another room so you can get some paperwork signed and things like that. Do you have, the lawyer rights? I can't even think of what that is right now. My brain's like off. And I said, no, I said, I don't have any of that on him. And he says, well, you're still his wife. You are his legal wife. And I said, yeah. He says, well, you should be able to sign paperwork without a problem then. So they shuffled me off one way and shuffled my family off another, and I went into this big room, and I could see behind these little screens, I could see his leg and his arm, and there's just this pool of blood on the floor. And I could just see they kind of had him just kind of draped in a sheet, and there was just so much blood from what I could see, and he was real quiet over there, and there was like this whole army of people, and he was all the way across the room, and I just remember having to look away thinking, okay, just don't even think about it. But I knew, just from his hand and his foot, that was him. And they were going over paperwork. And I just kept hearing, man, this guy's lucky he survived this long. Hopefully he makes it the night. Things like that, those comments. And thinking, please God. I mean, I'm a praying woman, but man, I crawled up into God's lap and said, take this on. I can't do this. I literally, for once, gave it all to God because I knew it wasn't me. So, after filling out form after form after form, including forms that if for some reason his heart stops or whatever, his wishes are not to be resuscitated, and having to sign that kind of stuff, knowing that that's what he would want, and that he didn't want to be put on life support if it looked like, he wouldn't come out of it normal. And just this huge amount of paperwork, which is the dumbest thing in the world to have to do to somebody right before, I mean, it just was ridiculous. But, I understand why. Because, I mean, they can't do anything unless they have permission. And he wasn't in any state to be, making any kind of calls. So then they shuffled me back out and said they would let me know when his surgery was over and I could see him. then I was back out in the waiting room, in a different waiting room, the surgery waiting room, when a nurse came out and she said, we still have a couple more forms that we need that they missed downstairs, but the good news is he's still awake and he's in there with me right now. She says you can come see him and see him before his surgery. We walked for what seemed like forever. Couldn't believe how big this hospital is. It's huge, but once you're walking all over the place, it's amazing how massive it is. And here I'm just waddling everywhere because I'm so huge from my pregnancy, and my feet are killing me. And I finally came around the corner, and there he was laying on a gurney. And they had him all covered up and bandages everywhere, and they had a couple of surgery techs and stuff right there working on him and doing IVs and things like that. And there was a doctor standing there that was just filling out some paperwork, and this nurse is doing it. And I turned to her, I said, do you really think he's gonna make it? Because he was awake, but just barely. He was kind of talking, but he wasn't making a lot of sense. And she was a much older woman, and she says, I've been a nurse for a very long time. She says, I've seen people in worse shape that survive just fine. But she says, I've seen people who aren't in this bad a shape that don't. She says, so I can't even begin to tell you. And his doctor, one of the many, one of the orthopedic doctors, was right there, and he introduced himself and a couple of his guys, and he told me he says, we're not going to fix the arm tonight. He says, and if there's any other broken bones that we come across, he says, we're not going to fix them right now. He says, we're just cleaning wounds and just kind of setting things into place. He says, then we'll go in for a later surgery if he makes it through the night. And by this time, it's like 3 a.m. And we're waiting and waiting, and I'm filling out all his paperwork, and I'm talking to him, and I said, honey, do you understand what's happened? And he says, yeah. He says, I crashed my bike. I said, do you remember what happened? He says, no. He says, I think I remember something about a deer, and he says, that's all I can think of is I remember seeing a deer, and it was terrible, and I'm looking at him, I said, do you hurt? And he says, I think I'm more numb. He says, I can't feel anything. And the nurse piped up, she says, he's on some heavy duty pain meds right now. And she says, plus he's still working off adrenaline. She says, with trauma like this, the adrenaline can last almost a full day. She says, it really depends on the person. And the only thing he had to complain about is he had to fart. Go figure, there's my husband for you. And I told him, I said, you're in a hospital. They know people do it. Just go for it. And I said, if, you make a mess, you make a mess. That's what they have people for. I was a CNA. I was one of those people that was for. And so he did, but I told him, I said, just be careful when you do it, because, I said, your stomach is split open. I said, I don't want you pushing anything out that you shouldn't. And so he did, and then he's great. He says, I feel so much better. He says, I've been holding that in for probably a couple hours now. He didn't even remember being on care flight, so he just bits and pieces he could only remember. He was awake the whole time, but he couldn't remember anything that had happened. So then it came time that I was all done with the paperwork, and it was time for him to go back into surgery. They had gotten most of the bleeding to stop, so he was still critical condition, but he was stable enough that they weren't concerned for him for that couple of seconds I could spend with him. So I kissed him goodbye. And I yelled at him for interrupting my bath. He apologized. And I apologize for the stuff I had said. I didn't even care that we had this audience standing there. So he was wheeled back and I was chauffeured back out, and we waited and waited and waited. It was like 3 hours and we're sitting there, and they, in that time, had brought out his bag of clothes, which luckily my brothers wouldn't let me go through. They took it into the bathroom and pulled his badge and stuff like that off because he's a security guard. Lots of little just stuff that's all over his uniform, pins and stuff. And we're looking for wallet and all that stuff. And it was good because they said that it was gory. Looked like something out of a horror scene. And they gave the bag to his friend Chris because Chris needed to take it to work to prove that, the uniform had been destroyed. Because he was wearing his uniform underneath all those leathers. Go figure. And for some reason there was only one boot in the bag. I don't understand that. I guess the other one got left on the ambulance or something. But his wallet was in there. His keys weren't. His phone was in there. A few other things. And we just kept waiting and waiting. And I just kept thinking, it still says the same thing on the board, that. And the doctor only said it'd be an hour. Here it's been like 2 hours. I don't understand. And they didn't have a receptionist there anymore. They don't keep them there overnight. So he just waited. So we had nobody to ask. And finally, the doctor I had talked to before he went in, and a couple of his techs, he says, "Why are you still sitting here?" And I said, "We're waiting for him to get out of surgery." He says, "He's been out of surgery for over an hour in recovery." He says, "He's up in ICU." He says, "Nobody came and told you?" And I'm going, "No." So he told us where ICU was. And my brothers had given up. My mom was still there. And his friend Chris had given up. And they had already left and gone home. And so my mom and I went over to ICU, and they said, "Well, we're still trying to get him situated into his room and everything. Just wait a minute." And she says, "Give us about 10 minutes. So about 15 minutes later, we picked up the phone because it's a locked unit. And they're still working on him. She says, "Give us about 10 more minutes." And, 10 more minutes passes, and they still don't come back out for us. And so then my mom picks up the phone again, and they said, "Well, let me ask." And they said, "It's still going to be a few more minutes. We'll come out and get you." So we waited, and then like 45 minutes pass. And they still have not come out and gotten us. So my mom got on and just started tearing into him, yelling at him. Said, "You need to, let us in. This is his wife. She hasn't seen him but maybe 2 minutes all night. Enough is enough." So they finally let us in. And I just remember walking into that room, and he had tubes coming out of everywhere, and wires and IVs, and he still was, they didn't do a very good job cleaning him up. He just was this ridiculous mess. And I just wanted to collapse right then and there.